Welcome, everyone, to today's virtual policy forum, Building Racial Equity into the Drug Development System, Clinical Trials, Access, and Affordability. My name is Murray Ross, and I'm Vice President with Kaiser Permanente and Director of the Kaiser Permanente Institute for Health Policy. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Towards the end of our chat with each of our guest speakers, we'll take questions from the audience, so feel free to submit questions via the Ask Question box at the bottom of your screens at any point. We will also include questions participants submitted in advance of the event, and thank you to everyone who did so. If you experience difficulties, please submit a question to the host. This event is being recorded, and the video will be made available on the Institute for Health Policy's website in the next few weeks. That's kpihp.org. And we encourage participants and speakers to continue the conversation on social media by tagging @kpihp. This forum is the second in a series in which we examine structural racism in drug development and access to medicines, from initial investment in pharmaceutical research all the way through drug affordability. We held the first forum in December and featured speakers working to address racism and racial disparities in public, private, and charitable funding to build equity in what gets funded and who gets funded. And if you want to view that event, please visit our website again at kpihp.org. Today, we hope to answer some of the most burning public health and bioethical issues relating to drug development and access to medicines. We welcome Harriet Washington, an award-winning author and bioethicist, who will discuss structural racism in clinical research and what might be missing in the national dialogue. Also, Dr. Foluso Fakorede, CEO of Cardiovascular Solutions of Central Mississippi, who will discuss systemic barriers that prevent patients of color from accessing evidence-based care. We have a few goals for this conversation. First and foremost, we want you to come out of this event with new perspectives on issues in the national dialogue. Second, we want to lay out practical solutions. Many questions may sound philosophical, but we need to find an actionable path forward. Finally, our goal with this series is to highlight long-standing structural inequities in drug development and care delivery, not isolated one-off factors, and how they have adversely affected people of color. This means acting at the individual, organizational, and systems level. To repeat an excellent quote that I think I presented at the last forum from Angela Glover Blackwell, "You as an individual in this society may not carry personal racism, but that does not keep the system from operating in a racist way." We will start today's program with some opening remarks from Dr. Ronald Copeland, Senior Vice President of National Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Strategy and Policy, and Chief Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Officer for Kaiser Permanente. In this role, he leads Kaiser Permanente's program-wide efforts to ensure our strategic vision is successfully implemented to drive business and mission outcomes, empower communities that we serve, and result in all Kaiser Permanente members achieving health and healthcare outcomes that are high quality, equitable, and increasingly more affordable. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Copeland.
Thank you, Murray. And welcome to all our guests. I appreciate the opportunity to make a few opening remarks on behalf of Kaiser Permanente's sponsorship of this particular event. Kaiser Permanente has a longstanding commitment to equity, inclusion, and diversity. Throughout our 75-year history, we have consistently taken a stand for equity, inclusion, and diversity, and social justice. We view this commitment as inextricably linked to our mission and our service as one of the critical foundational pillars upon which we have built our enterprise. Our vision is anchored in our strategic framework regarding what we do in the health equity realm, the workforce equity realm, and the community equity. And it serves to focus on a vision of equity and inclusion for all that we are privileged to serve. Some examples of our taking a stand, if you will, has been, since our founding years, taking a stand against racial segregation of hospitals. We were early adopters of the culturally and linguistically appropriate standards for culturally responsive care, published by the Office of Minority Health, have built them into standards and practices across our care delivery system. Eliminating healthcare disparities, we did a large body of work over 10 years ago demonstrating that we could identify root causes of disparities, identify effective practices, and in fact, demonstrate closure and narrowing of those disparities gaps in several critical areas of chronic disease. And we also understand that it's important for our workforce at all levels, leaders, physicians, clinicians, administrative roles, and so forth, to reflect the diverse makeup of the communities that we are privileged to serve, so that we have an opportunity to have internal advisors and external facing ambassadors. Some keys to our effectiveness that I'd like to just highlight for a second is the important role of unapologetic leadership and courageous leadership in taking on the status quo for intentional and equitable transformation. Data transparency, understanding the notion that you can't manage what you can't measure, and you can't measure what you can't see. Commitment to learning, mitigating bias and racism, and innovating new practices informed by evidence and the voice of the patients and communities that we're privileged to serve. The notion of nothing about us without us. There's been a lot said recently about the challenges of trust in the COVID-19 vaccination realm. And a few trust building lessons that we've learned and have integrated in our work has been one that it's important to validate the lived experience of the individuals who have difficulty trusting an entity or an institution. This is really recognizing past abuses and present abuses from a continuum. So we don't limit our conversations regarding trust challenges to the Tuskegee work, which was critical as one example, but some abuses and breaking of promises that goes on even today. So this is current thinking, current concerns. We have to strive to be trustworthy rather than put the burden of trust on the people that we're here to serve, and become a trustworthy messenger rather than just leverage existing trustworthy messengers to deliver important instructions about wellness and health and support. During the COVID-19 scenario, we have also been involved in clinical trials in some of the vaccine development areas. Kaiser Permanente is a health system, but we also operate with research and our research organization engaged in clinical trials on a regular basis. Some of these same principles that have informed our work in this space in developing diverse population and participation in our clinical trials involved eliminating barriers to participation such as economics and distance travel with transportation challenges wherever possible, working with patient providers teams to serve as trusted messengers, folks who you already have an existing relationship with, helping you understand the opportunities for the clinical trials as well as the safety profiles engendered. And then our trial enrollments demonstrated that the role of oversampling of our participants of color has served to help us improve our representation, and we've had significant reduction in dropouts for those who chose to enroll. So as we stand here today, in the way of wrapping up my comments, I'm proud of the work we've done to date, but there's clearly much more to do in so many different areas regarding effective practices, as well as using our voices to advance the national policy dialogue and bring about meaningful change on a long-term basis. I'm humbled and excited to hear from today's set of highly accomplished speakers and look forward to using their knowledge and pearls of wisdom to inform our own equity inclusion journey going forward at Kaiser Permanente. Thank you very much for your participation. Looking forward to a great discussion. And now back to Murray to get things started.
Thank you so much, Ron. And the point you raise on the burden of proof on the trust side, I think, is a theme that's going to be coming up a couple of times in the next little while. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Harriet Washington. Harriet is a prolific science writer, editor, and ethicist who's authored 6 well-received books, including the seminal Medical Apartheid, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award, the Penn Oakland Award, and the American Library Association Black Caucus Nonfiction Award. Her most recent book, Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Medical Consent, was just published last week. Harriet holds or has held research and writing fellowships at numerous prestigious institutions, including Harvard Medical School, New York Academy of Medicine, the University of Nevada's Black Mountain Institute, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, DePaul University College of Law, the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee University, and Stanford University. She delivered the 2020 commencement speech to Columbia University's School of Public Health graduates and won Columbia's 2020 Mailman School of Public Health Leadership Award, as well as its 2020-21 Kenneth and Mamie Clark Distinguished Lecturer Award. Harriet, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to engage in a conversation for the next little while, and hopefully it won't be an interrogation, but actually something closer to a fireside chat. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Excuse me. Harriet, the subject of racism and racial inequity in clinical trials has been in laser focus since the COVID-19 pandemic began. For those who are still new to this issue, could you take a step back and tell us a bit about both historical and present day injustices and missteps?
Well, unfortunately, there have been way too many of those. And unfortunately, we have a long history in this country of 4 centuries of abuse in the medical arena, particularly in research settings when African Americans were disproportionately had their bodies and tissues appropriated without consent, and also were inveigled into some very bloody, invasive, and dangerous research studies, again without their consent, and also with a very inappropriate risk-benefit balance. The non-consensual impression of African Americans into medical research is something that's taken place over 4 centuries and unfortunately has not completely ended today. And we have to keep that in mind when we think about people's reluctance or their purported reluctance to engaging in medical research and clinical trial design. And there is no sphere of American medicine over the past 4 centuries that has not hosted at some point. Reproductive surgeries, involuntary, were done on African American women. Other involuntary surgeries done on African American men. In the prisons, with children, and radiation studies done in the right after World War II, in mid-century. As I said, there's no area of American medicine in which African Americans were not abused, and this long history has to be taken into account whenever we talk about restoring faith in the healthcare system.
I must say, having read your book, Medical Apartheid, that was tough reading, and there were a few examples in there that I guess I'll say we've all heard of, but there were a couple hundred pages of things that most of us hadn't heard of, and it's compelling, and I recommend it. You've spoken in the past about how the news and dialogue on certain issues can be curated. How is the conversation on clinical trials being curated today?
Right.
What are people not understanding or misunderstanding?
Well, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings being perpetuated by this careful curation of not only the history of medicine, but contemporary issues. For example, we find ourselves talking on almost a daily basis about the U.S. Public Health Service study at Tuskegee, in which hundreds of African American men with syphilis were forced into research where they were not treated, but rather had their disease observed until they died. Now, this was certainly a horrible study. It was like 40 years long, the longest instance of medical abuse in the research arena in Western history, but it's only one study. There are other studies that, in my opinion, were even more unethical, definitely more fatal and more dangerous, more painful. And so, unfortunately, though, whenever we talk about African American distrust of the healthcare system, people evoke Tuskegee. And the problem with that is, if you only speak about Tuskegee, if Tuskegee is the only thing that you know about, then the implication is that African Americans are overreacting to a single study, which is not the case. The case is that African Americans are reacting to 4 centuries of consistent abuse. So we're talking about Tuskegee too much. We should be talking about the history and present of abuses in the research system. And then also, I think we had an unfortunate situation in this country where there was a lot of hand-wringing over the purported failure of African Americans to participate in clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccine, when in reality, when the data were published, we found that African Americans joined trials at 10%. They were 10% of subjects. They're only 12.4% of the population. So I submit that they actually had a fairly respectable showing, commensurate with their rate in the population. So I think we have to be careful to be guided by data and not be guided by the narratives that we have come to habitually adapt when we talk about access problems.
You have well documented centuries of history of abuses. Are there examples of practices that are still prevalent or at least existing today that you can point to?
Well, there are quite a few things, unfortunately, that still exist today. The 19th century Victorian doctors and scientists, the best in the nation, told the world and the country who African Americans were. These were mythologies. They were simply restatements of long-standing myths, but they clothed them with data and made them sound as if they were scientific. Among them were their belief that African Americans didn't feel pain the way whites did, that their belief that African Americans didn't suffer from mental disorders, that we had our own diseases that white people didn't get, and that we were immune to diseases that killed white people, like yellow fever. None of this was true, but it was absorbed by the medical profession. And even today, we might laugh at the thought that doctors once thought that Black people didn't feel pain, but a study in 2016 from the University of Virginia shows that 50%, 1 in 2 medical students polled, felt that African Americans didn't feel pain the way whites do. It's still a common belief. A lot of the Victorian beliefs from the 19th century are still common beliefs. And the other thing that the 19th century doctors kindly bequeathed us was a blame the victim attitude toward African American health problems. All too often we had begin interrogating African Americans in terms of, well, what behaviors are they engaging in that perpetuate their illness, or what's wrong with their bodies. And so this biological dimorphism, where we believe that African American bodies are different from white bodies, is also a holdover from that. So, and then the last thing, and probably the most disturbing thing, is my recent book, Carte Blanche, talks about the fact that unfortunately, we still have non-consensual research in this country. It's something that we think that we said goodbye to after Nuremberg, but unfortunately, some changes to the Code of Federal Regulations mean that certain research, we don't elicit consent. And I think that's a step backward. And certainly when people learn of this, I think it serves to erode trust in the research system.
Thank you. In the context of the vaccines, we're hearing a lot about the need for messengers to communicate to the Black community and trusted voices. But I think I've heard you say or write that the real issue is not just, well, that is an issue, but the real issue is the healthcare system itself. So I guess, and you've pushed back on the notion, as you've just said, that we should be holding the people who are mistrustful responsible for that. Right. And in fact, the burden should be on the healthcare system to, if not regain trust, but to create trust. How can we go about that?
Well, that's exactly a good summary of what I think. I think that, we focus on African-American behavior as if the pathological behavior of African-Americans is causing the problem. But the problem is also being caused by a healthcare system that's not trustworthy. If it's not trustworthy, people aren't going to trust it. And of course, the solution, it's very facile to say this, but the solution is to make the system trustworthy. If it's trustworthy, people will flock to it. They won't be afraid of it. The hard question is, of course, how do you do this? It's not an easy thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that there are many ways we should attack this. We should continue to encourage African Americans to pursue care that is going to ultimately benefit them. But we should also systemically interrogate the healthcare system, see where it's failing to treat people equitably, see where it's failing to address real issues, see where it is actually creating problems, as it does sometimes, by making it look as if African American bodies are so different that they're prone to disease, when really there's something else going on. Systemically, we have to interrogate that and then address it. And ultimately, that is the thing that is going to, I think, engender greater faith in the system. But that takes time. It's not something you can do automatically by social marketing by showing Black doctors taking the vaccine. That's a good thing to do, but it's just not enough.
Okay, well, we're getting some questions on clinical trials and COVID, but I think we'll come back to them in a minute or two. I want to switch topics just for a minute and talk about patents, because I know that is actually another subject area that you've written about. In our last forum, Preeti Krishtal gave a keynote speech describing how structural racism impacts drug development and access to medicines, from initial funding all the way through affordability. The patent system was one area she brought attention to, which people may never even have considered to examine. You know, given your experience and the work you've done on your book, Deadly Monopolies, can you tell us more about how structural racism shows up in patents and intellectual property?
Yes. In Deadly Monopolies, I decried the fact that since the Bayh-Dole Act and associated laws were passed, the transfer of intellectual property, patents from universities and research centers to corporations means that corporations now control a great deal of medical research. And it operates against people of color in several ways. One axis is economic, because corporations, profit-making companies, capitalist society, is nothing wrong with making a profit, but if one's sole focus is profit making, and then one's focused on maximizing the money you can make from a patent, if healthcare considerations become secondary, that's very dangerous for people who don't have a great deal of money. When you have medications that are priced above people's ability to pay, or you have populations, as you have in the global south and developing world, populations who are poor, so that the incentive to develop medicines for them can't be an economic one. The corporation is not going to be able to make money and stay solvent if they make drugs for people who can't afford to pay the price they need to pay. So these are that's only one axis. You also have racial disparities that, frankly, I don't pretend to understand. We have diseases like sickle cell anemia, where we've been very slow to find, direct treatments, and yet other molecular diseases like cystic fibrosis actually had good treatments developed more earlier. One could argue it's economics, but I think there's probably more than that at stake. I think that our reliance on the patent system has not worked well for anybody. I don't think it works really well for people of color or other people. And we need to modify the way that we do it. I think that, of course, corporations have the right to make money. They have a right to stay solvent. But we need to have a more nuanced system, as in other countries where they won't give a blanket 20-year patent for everything, but they will have patents that can be renewed. They actually have other systems that reward companies for the number of lives they save, instead of, allowing them to charge any amount of money, whether people can afford it or not. We need to refine our system. I'm not proposing we throw it out at all, but I am proposing that we tailor it more closely to the actual needs of people, including people who have little money, including marginalized people whose medical issues don't always get the attention that they should.
We talked about the example of sickle cell and cystic fibrosis at our last meeting, but I think that was more documenting the existence of the disparity rather than discussing the solution to it. Do you have any thoughts on how you'd go about getting a more equitable research agenda?
In general, I think one of the things we need to do is we have documented some disparities very well, repeatedly, consistently, and I think we have enough documentation on them, and it is time to craft policies. But part of the problem is that we're not systemically looking at everything. Pain, for example, is well documented, but I'm concerned about other things as well. There are many anecdotal accounts from African Americans that when they have symptoms and when they have pain and go to hospitals, their symptoms aren't always accorded the treatment they think it deserves. People, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, I hear from many people every day who say, I went to the hospital, I had symptoms that sound like coronavirus, they didn't even evaluate me. The internist, Dr. Susan Moore, said the same thing, and she was a doctor. So how do we address that? I think one of the things we have to do is look beyond increased education and training. That's a very good thing to do. But I think that we need to approach some of these disparities like quality of care issues. You know, if an individual physician or an individual research center or a hospital cannot consistently produce a record of treating people of color the same way they treat whites, then there should be some consequences as well as rewards. I believe in rewarding people for the right behavior, but I think sometimes we are very loath because we admire and respect physicians so much. We're very loath to think about, penalties that could be meaningful. I'm put in mind of the hand washing problem that arose in hospitals when, they're foci of infection, and hand washing is really important, and yet a small minority of physicians were not conforming to hand washing strictures, and hospitals were at a loss of how to do that. They were appointing nurses to remind the doctors to wash their hands. That wasn't very popular, and it didn't work very well. But one hospital decided to institute penalties. Surgeons who were not conforming to hand washing regulations found that their pay was being cut. I actually don't think that's a bad idea. It worked very well, by the way. They saw the changes they wanted to see almost right away. And I think that demonstrating that you are practicing medicine that is equitable, racially equitable, should be a condition for finishing medical school, finishing your residency, for advancing in your profession, advancing in your institution. Adding that to the rewards that we should give people for doing that, and to the training and education, I think that would really help get some result. The thing about the pain control studies that I've noticed is that people often say, okay, if physicians are not treating African American pain appropriately, if they're sending African Americans away with statements that they're drug seeking instead of treating their pain, then we need better education and training. True. But I also think that we have to remember that there aren't textbooks that tell medical students that African Americans don't feel pain like whites do. I doubt very seriously that anybody's giving a lecture like that. They're learning it on the clinical floors. And so the behavior that they see modeled with African Americans being consistently sent away as drug seeking instead of having their pain treated is something that they, absorb and then they pass on to the next generation. I think that we need things other than education and training to arrest that vicious cycle and to make it clear that there are penalties for behaving this way instead of rewards.
Have you talked to the specialty societies about this? I mean, I take your point. If we try to address it just through medical school, it's going to take us 2 generations to see the change. Right. But the other place that the physician community looks toward their specialty societies, and are they hearing this message?
I don't know. That's a very good idea. I think you're absolutely right. That's a very good idea. No one's approached me. Maybe I should think about suggesting it.
Because they are sort of the professional standard setting bodies for the physician community. I also just wanted to pick up, and maybe you can speak to this. So at least some of the difference in the care disparities reflects differences in health coverage, Medicaid versus commercial. But we also see differences in commercial populations between white and Black patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, do you attribute that to just sort of a core belief that people are being treated differently? Let me ask the question a little bit differently. It's one thing to say, well, when I'm in an environment of a very low reimbursement, I might be tempted to turn people away. But for commercial insurance, where I have good reimbursement, that turning people away imposes a cost on anybody who's paid on fee for service.
Right. That's true. However, African Americans, for example, are less likely to have high quality insurance, so less likely to benefit from that dynamic. You're absolutely right. But that's one of the barriers that I see between them and good health care. The fact that African American is less likely to have their own personal physician to advocate for them in the system, less likely to have quality insurance that will allow them the options they need. So, I think that this is a multifaceted problem. I think we have everything in the mix. everything from, unconscious bias to explicit bias, which we don't like to talk about, which I get. It's very unpleasant. And policies such as the ones you mentioned, Medicare policies, insurance policies that stand between some people getting the optimal, care that they need. So I think something we have to attack on all fronts, and that's why we need systemic research that is should be open-ended, without preconceptions, identifying a problem and then trying to find out, of course, where it's emanating from, and then maybe attacking all sides.
Thank you. So switching gears a little bit here, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the nexus between personalized medicine and I'll call it racial stereotyping. And the question is, how do we reconcile the notion of greater racial equity in drug development while recognizing at the same time that race itself is not a genetic or biological factor, but a social construct? And you may even want to talk a little bit, if you can, about assumptions people have made about the genetic differences.
There's a lot there to unpack. And, you're right there. But the thing is, when we talk about personalized medicine, the semantics get a bit distorted. If we're really talking about personalized medicine, tailoring medicine to the peculiar characteristics, weaknesses, strength of a person, then we're talking about more than genetics, aren't we? Genetics is part of that, but there are other things that are part of it too. One aspect of it that I find really important, but I'm not sure everyone agrees with me that it's important, is environmental exposure. We know environmental exposure is a very potent predictor and determinant of people's health. And yet, I don't see it discussed in tandem with personalized medicine. I think it should be. So I think we need to look beyond genetics, and maybe we should even look beyond biological dimorphism, the difference in bodies. There are so many differences that cause, healthcare, have healthcare effects, that we need to be a little bit more inclusive. When we are looking at genetics, I think sometimes a mistake is made, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think the mistake is made of confusing people's heredity with genetics, confusing people's ancestry with genetics. The truth is that in this country, we don't know our ancestry. We have such a strong racial, we've had to deal hundreds of years with these very strong racial taboos that prevent us from knowing our ancestry. So, a good proportion of people who consider themselves African American don't seem to have any physiological evidence of that. And I've read only briefly one paper about white Americans, but many white Americans, when tested, they find that they have, alleles that seem to come from African sources. People who have no idea that they have any Black or African ancestry. So, we have to start with that realization that talking about, genetic reality in this country is fraught with all kinds of taboos and difficulties and ignorance. And so when we're talking about ancestry, we don't often know who we're talking about. And we're talking about genetics maps very poorly onto ancestry. So it's easy to see that, you have all these compounding factors that all contribute to errors in this arena. You're looking for ancestry, but you're using genetics, and genetics would not be a good correlation anyway. But it's hopeless when you don't really know your ancestry. So I think that we need to pull back from trying to force genetics on the Procrustean bed of personalized medicine and look instead at the person. Because frankly, from my perspective, if you're relying upon genetics, then what you're doing is not personalized medicine at all. It's racial medicine. It's stereotype medicine, as you suggested. So, I think we have a lot more refinement to make with these suggestions. And I really want to see environmental effects included in the mix, because I think they're so important, especially for people of color.
So how do we think about that for people doing clinical research? What advice do you give them in terms of how do you know that you have, I'll just call it an equitable trial population? Again, I think there's still this challenge for people trying to say, I don't want to classify people by race because I'm running a clinical research trial that is based on biological response, and yet we don't have other quote unquote markers for how do we know if we're getting a large enough distribution.
Yeah, it's a catch-22, isn't it? Because it's not a biological entity, but we're treating it like one in medicine. We do that a lot. And sometimes it makes little sense to do that. I'm not certain how much sense it makes in a clinical setting. You can easily think of examples of times when it would be important to know someone's race or the race that they're perceived as belonging to. But, that's how I think of it. As long as you remember that what race really tells us is the race that you're seen as belonging to. It doesn't tell you about anything about your inherent makeup. And so when you think about it that way, then it just becomes, really difficult. If what we're really aiming at is making sure that people who are identified as minority populations, identified as African American, Hispanic American, Native American, if we're really trying to make sure that they are included in clinical research, then that inclusion should be the goal. Not necessarily identifying them genetically or physiologically, but just including them. So I think that the proxy is usually just to label them as Black or Hispanic, whatever, and then include them. And that might be the best thing we can do. But I think if you start looking at physiological markers, then you're going to get even farther afield. Because the fact that a person lacks those markers doesn't mean that they're not Native American, doesn't mean that they're not African American. So it's a bit of a maelstrom we've created for ourselves with this concept of race. It's almost like a prison. And I don't know all the answers, but I do know that if you want to include everybody, then that could be done simply by, using race as that proxy. People who identify as African American, they're perceived as African American, you make sure that they're present in the study in a large enough percentage to make the study meaningful for them. So that obviously in a crude way means that if you're doing a study of sickle cell anemia, you wouldn't do that with no African Americans, So it's a hard one for me anyway.
The challenge here, I'm a labor economist by training, and there's a long history of economists studying differences in earnings and wages and wealth in the population, and the statistical equations invariably include a marker for race, Black, white, other, and no one ever does anything with that except to note that it's negative. The earnings are lower, but it's a proxy for so many other things.
Right. I feel a bit impatient. I read medical journal articles, and specifying somebody's race is such an important, a consistent way of describing the patient. But what information does that really convey? Does it really tell you anything? What it tells me is that this is a person who's treated like she's African American, but I'm not really sure how meaningful it is. I'm something I really wish we could be free of, frankly, but I'm not sure that's going to happen.
We have a ways to go. I just want to remind people in the audience to please submit your questions for Harriet, and they're going to get fed through to me, hopefully. And while those are coming in, Harriet, let me ask you, as we're moving forward, to think both about the policy and the public policy and the private policy side. Let's talk about public policy first. What are your hopes for a new administration, a new Congress, and maybe not pinning everything on those two parties, but just going forward? What should we be looking to at federal or state or even local levels?
In terms of maximize health, there's several things I'd love to see happen. One thing that happened is really good. I'm very happy that there have been included experts in the social dimension of medicine. Alondra Nelson being appointed was very, very important to me. So having that dimension early, incorporated in government, part of decision-making policy that's really great. But the things I worry about are things like the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which is basically gutted over the past 4 years and now needs to be rebuilt. Also, I'm concerned about legal policies governing medical research. I have thought for a very long time, at least 15 years now, that we've made an error when it comes to institutional review boards, the boards that approve medical research. I think it's a mistake to have only one layperson on the board, as the law stipulates. You know, that layperson is looking at what, 15, 16 scientists? They can't have any real say or any voice, any real power. And yet we're putting the burden on that one person to represent a community of laypersons. That's, to me, that is it's really it's problematic. How can you expect a body like that to approve studies with full cognizance of, how it could be problematic for the subjects who are going to fill it? It's not, they can't do that. It's not really fair. I think it's a bad plan. I would much rather see us have policies like IRBs be composed of half subjects, lay people who would become subjects, and then half scientists, so that from the beginning, there'll be a better chance of incorporating the viewpoint of laypersons, which could, I certainly would hope, would end up with research studies that might be more palatable to people. I also think that healthcare policy should be changed in other basic ways. I want to see people examine the role of lobbyists in healthcare. I think that it's a distorting role. They're lawmakers we've elected to do our will, and lobbyists sometimes, I think, can really muddy the waters in terms of what the general people, what laypersons want from the government. So I think there are some big policy changes I want to see made, but I also want to see more funding for things like how can I put this? Those corporations who are intent on providing medications to underserved people. I've seen a few cases where they have invested a lot of money and worked really hard, sometimes with NGOs like the Gates Foundation, in trying to create equitable access to medications. And I think the government could play a larger role in supporting that. I think there should be larger rewards for companies that do that. When companies do the right thing, I think we want to, encourage them to do the right thing. And it would have benefits beyond the individual people who are helped. It would have benefits in terms of the healthcare system, making it more equitable, making it more fair, making it something that people are going to think of as a positive way rather than think of negatively. So anyway, I could go on for days, but the bottom line is I think there are some very basic changes that should be made in the law. And we need to have lawmakers who are going to be open to making them. I would love to see more scientists who are has spent a lot of their time in universities and research organizations rather than in the government, so that they can, represent the mentality of, research people and caregivers who want to broaden access. So I hope we'll see all those things.
Yeah, getting lay representation, patient representation is a challenge pretty much across the board, whether it's payment policy or drug approvals or any number of things. I want to go to an audience question here. To what extent can community-based participatory research be used as a method or a tool to help advance health equity?
That's a great question. I think it can be a really rich tool. Involving the communities in the healthcare system, again, serves to lower that barrier that, makes people aversive or prevents people from being able to fully engage and trust it. So if you can involve community groups, not only in the work of the healthcare agencies, but also in determining the direction. A long time ago, I talked to a group of white researchers who'd been very successful in research programs that involved people of color. They were in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, and they were enrolling people in medical research at a very good rate. I wanted to find out, why are you successful? And they all told me basically the same thing. They said, when we make it clear that we're there for the duration, We're not helicoptering in to get our results and then disappear. If I'm not going to be there 5 years from now, I make it clear that the people I work with, my students, will be there. There'll always be a presence there. So people knew that we were there for the duration, and they had more trust in us. We also asked them what they needed from us. Not that we could necessarily promise it to them, but we wanted them to be able to help have a voice in setting the agenda. And we did everything that we could to incorporate their concerns in what actually happened. And those are the things that seem to, make them very, very effective in providing better care and involving these groups in medical research. Anything that can be done, I think, to improve those relations between the community and the medical institutions that serve it is a good thing. So I'd love to see more of this.
Well, I'm going to ask you kind of another variant of the same question. There are a lot of people on this forum who have both the will and the power to change how clinical research is performed, both people who are running clinical trials, people who are using clinical research. We have a fair representation of industry in the forum. And maybe you could just sort of speak to a couple of those different, I don't like the term stakeholders, participants in the research process.
Well, to those people, I would urge them to engage the communities from whom they draw their subjects in every aspect of research as much as you can, because if they have a role or a voice in deciding which studies are done, how they're done, what approaches are and aren't used, then they're going to be invested in it. And the challenge of recruiting subjects, that's one less hurdle that you'll be dealing with. I think that's really important. That's very good for the community that you're serving, and it's very good for you and your research agenda. I think that's important. Other thing I'm going to say is a bit of an iconoclastic thing, but I feel it strongly, so I have to speak out on it. And that is, I am deeply concerned about the prevalence of research that does not involve informed consent, or indeed any consent. Since 1996, we've had that change in the law that permitted trauma victims to be involved in medical research without their consent. I think I understand a lot of the impetus for it. Conducting research is very time-consuming, it's very difficult, and people welcome something that's going to make you able to complete it more quickly. But here I think it's a really bad bargain. Removing consent from the equation, especially with an utter lack of transparency, is probably going to do more to potentiate distrust than most things that you can do. I think it's a misstep. It's something that we shouldn't be doing, and we should find other routes to being able to conduct research more quickly and effectively.
We have time for just one more question, and maybe it might even from the audience, and it might even be the subject for your next book. So maybe you could just make up the book abstract on the spot.
There you go.
Can you please address bias in analytical tools such as artificial intelligence and algorithms? They've been in the news.
Right. It's a huge problem that I don't claim any particular expertise in, but I know it's been around for a long time. I first became concerned about that back in the 1980s when I saw that there was a debate about the HLA-6 match for kidney transplants, with some doctors saying that it was absolutely essential to give recipients the best chance for survival, and others saying that it was not necessary, but it did nothing but serve to exclude many African American donors. So eventually the research seemed to support that latter belief. And I began thinking about, all these algorithms and tools, they look, the problem, of course, with them is that they're designed to be objective. Nobody puts one of these in place with the idea that they're going to use them as a tool to separate people from healthcare. Of course not, but that still happens. It can happen without any conscious, desire to do it, simply because of built-in flaws in the system and the way that we think about disease. So we have to be very vigilant. And I think that this kind of vigilance is the kind of thing that how can I put this? It's not easy to see, but I think we need to interrogate some of our tools, our supposedly unbiased objective tools, more closely than we do. And I also think that there are scholars and scientists who think about this in particular. I'm thinking of Ruha Benjamin, for example, who's done a lot of work in this area. And I think that very often it's going to be, I'm not saying always, of course not, but very often it's going to be scientists and researchers of color who will see these things. They are going to be primed to recognize more quickly than other scientists sometimes. Reason 999 why it's a very good thing to have as many expert scientists and physicians of color as we can, helping to make these policies as well as care for people. It's a big problem, and we have to just guard against falling to a state of complacency where we think that because we are being unbiased and the tools look objective, that they are objective. As we know, sometimes they're not.
Well, as Dr. Copeland noted, you can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't measure what you don't see. So, Harriet Washington, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you in our forum here today. It has been an educational journey reading your work and learning from you, and I thank you for your contributions, and I'm sure everyone has taken a lot away from your remarks today.
Thank you. The pleasure has been all mine, believe me.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to Foluso Fakorede. Dr. Fakorede is CEO of Cardiovascular Solutions of Mississippi. He is a physician, entrepreneur, and advocate for healthcare justice who spent his formative years in Nigeria and came to America as a teenager. He earned his medical degree from the University of Medicine and Dentistry, New Jersey, Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. He completed internship and residency in internal medicine at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Hospital and fellowships in cardiology, interventional cardiology, and endovascular intervention at Cooper University Hospital in Camden, New Jersey. Thank you, Foluso, for joining us. Before we get into our conversation, I'm going to turn it over to you for a presentation of some of the work you've been doing.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Good afternoon from the Mississippi Delta, and it's an honor to follow Mrs. Washington. What an intriguing and insightful conversation. Thank you to the organizers, and I just want to give a special shout out to all the women out there who are affecting change on this historic month as we start Women's History Month. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to shed some light on my mission here and my job here, which is basically to highlight disturbing practices occurring in particularly communities of color and low socioeconomic communities where you have preventable amputations being performed at a disproportionately high rates. And the disease is called peripheral arterial disease, and the management of this disease in these patients is something that really highlights what systemic racism can do to our healthcare system. I have no disclosures. All patients consented to sharing of their information and pictures in this presentation. It's important to note that there are megatrends that are impacting the cardiovascular field. We have an aging and growing population with octogenarians being high on the list, prevalence of chronic diseases that disproportionately affects minorities, changes that are coming down the pike in terms of fee-for-service versus value-based care. We have an aging cardiology healthcare workforce with projected shortages not only within our field, but also the primary care fields that also disproportionately affect special regions. And then we have social determinants of health, which includes systemic racism, and then healthcare consolidation in terms of its impact and how monopolies are formed. And so when you look at the social determinants of health piece, it's important to understand that health outcomes of patients are determined not only by where you're born, where you live, but also the economic stability, the neighborhoods that surrounds, and physical environments that surrounds your existence, and also educational equity, the food equity that's available there, community engagement, and as also healthcare coverage. That all determines if you live, if you die, and also determines if your livelihood gets upended. Real brief history on Mississippi. Cotton was king in Mississippi, as we all know, with Mississippi being the fourth wealthiest region during slavery. And that, unfortunately, that history has an enduring legacy today, with 40% of its population still being Black, the highest of any state. Unfortunately, it's also been decimated with the highest poverty rate, low per capita income, the lowest number of physicians per capita in the country, low literacy level, and lowest life expectancy levels. 1 in 3 Black patients in the state are uninsured. We have a total of about 516,000 out of the 3 million residents of Mississippi. Mississippi has yet to elect a Black candidate to statewide office since 1890, and we have the highest proportion of vulnerable rural hospitals, with 7 counties that lack access to care. And we have less than 10 endocrinologists in the state of Mississippi. Why is that important? Well, the 2 unique health challenges that will pose the greatest health burden to our healthcare system are diabetes and obesity, also known as the diabetes epidemic. And Mississippi has ranked in the top 3 rankings of those categories since its inception in terms of documentation based on research. And majority of these diseases are taken care and are need to be addressed and assessed by specialists, endocrinologists being one of them for diabetes. And we only have about 8 in the whole state. This addresses some of the lack of access to care in terms of diabetes management within the state, and why primary care physicians are left with that burden, in addition to other burdens of taking care of the diabetes management for a lot of the residents. In the next 2 decades, Black Americans will have the highest rates of cardiovascular disease. And if you look at the burden of health in America from 1990 to 2018, we've seen a 36% decline in mortality and death and morbidity in these patients. However, we've yet to see the same equitable percentages achieved, especially in regions like Mississippi and in other communities where you have high percentage of minorities. So this is a 54-year-old mechanic who I saw when I came to start my practice here in 2015. History of diabetes, hypertension, end-stage renal disease, on hemodialysis. Made about $39,000 a year, had 3 kids. Prior to my presentation to this region, he had his right great toe amputated, and then he had a non-healing ulcer that was treated by a wound care center, and did not have any prior vascular evaluation, which is important for anyone who has poor circulation. You'll need to see what's going on with the vasculatry to determine if you can basically open up all those blockages before an amputation is performed. And that also enables things like, your antibiotics and other things that are used to treat the wound to actually get to an organ. And here, this is an image where we spent about an hour and a half opening up the blood vessels to his legs and his feet. And I fly out of town that Friday, and I come back that Tuesday, and the patient has had an amputated leg. This happened under my watch. And that's when I decided to fight this injustice, because if a patient can undergo an amputation after a physician performs a successful revascularization, what happens when such physicians are not around? So we have regional variability in delivery of care. If you look at the amputation rates in the country, on the left, you see that we have the highest rates of amputation in the Medicare population, predominantly in the South, which also overlaps with the Black Census Scope of America, which is in the middle. And if you look at the right, you see that the lowest number of procedures that are done to save and salvage limbs are also least done in the same region. Hence your highest amputation rates in terms of the Black Census Scope of America. Even the U.S. Surgeon General posted this a day before he left office, asking why our U.S. healthcare system spends $800 million a year on amputations, but we fail to spend the same equitable dollars to prevent or address the preventative side of diabetes that leads to amputation in the first place. And so peripheral arterial disease is the circulatory deficiency that we've basically talked about the last couple of minutes. It affects 20 million Americans that we know of. It has been documented as the most prevalent, most deadly, most costly disease state that most Americans have never heard of. Most people have heard of cancer, and it's similar to peripheral arterial disease in that they're both slow, they're progressive, and they're deadly. And if not caught on time, they can lead to death. Death rates from peripheral arterial disease and its end stage are worse than most cancers. On the right, you see breast cancer, skin cancer, and prostate cancer, which actually are less than peripheral arterial disease, which is very disconcerting. It's also disconcerting that we have an extremely prevalent numbers of peripheral arterial disease that we're seeing in our aging population, in our diabetic population, and also in our obese population. Again, the diabesity population. The co-prevalence of the #1 killer of Americans, which is cardiovascular disease, among peripheral arterial disease patients is one of the highest, 6 times higher. And the patient makeup are also getting larger. Diabetic population, we have 34 million that are diabetic and 80 million that are pre-diabetic. Your chronic kidney patients, 37 million in the US, majority of whom are African Americans. Your rates of diabetes in African American population actually is actually 55 to 60% higher chance of a Black patient becoming a diabetic than a white patient. Smokers, one of the leading preventable causes of death. But what's unknown in the literature is we don't document how many African Americans dip, chew, or vape, right? That is equitable when it comes to exposure to nicotine. So why is diabetes so impactful in this state? Most patients present with severe ischemia, meaning a severe form of the disease. They present with more ulcers and gangrene at onset. They're less to get screened. Their rates of amputation increases with age and severity in terms of what part of their limbs actually gets amputated, and the contralateral limb as well. As high as 28x amputation rates that are higher. And you have an increased cost with majority of these diabetics getting diagnosed now at a younger age. Why is it slow and progressive? Because most of these patients just don't have the symptoms that you typically see in patients who have your onset of pain, numbness, or their limbs giving out. These patients come in with just subtle symptoms and they're not picked on time. And by the time they're picked on and at the time that they're diagnosed, they lead to critical limb ischemia, which is the end form where you see a non-healing wound, an ulcer, or you get rest pain and also pain on exertion. These patients have a very high rates of having adverse cardiovascular outcomes. And so what is the pathway to an amputation? A major amputation occurs frequently as the first therapy offered to patients who have end-stage peripheral arterial disease. The national average is about 50 to 70%. Here in a state like Mississippi, 90% of amputees have never had any type of workup before an amputation. And usually this workup entails an angiogram. Despite the fact that an angiogram decreases the odds of an amputation by 90%, majority of patients are not offered one. And this is unacceptable in 2021. Now, an amputation versus revascularization is determined by your socioeconomic status, but also what I call the amputation lottery, where you are and where you live, if you're a female, if you're a minority, your hospital volume in terms of how much cases they do in terms of limb salvage work versus amputations, and then if you're poor, and if you're a Medicaid or Medicare patient versus a commercial patient in terms of insurance. And the evils of amputation actually should not go ignored. A majority of these patients cannot walk with significant reduced quality of life, and it takes these patients out of the workforce of the communities they live in. You have a high mortality rate peri-procedurally. And majority of these amputees are not discharged home and they'll go to nursing home or rehab facilities where reimbursements actually come to play in terms of what's reimbursed versus not. In addition, the general cost of caregiving is estimated lifetime to be close to 500 to 800,000 for a patient. And you can only imagine if these amputations are occurring in regions that are poorest, there's no fair fight in terms of who wins that battle. There's a high mortality rate. 80% of amputees are dead within 5 years, and 95% live with chronic pain. And we all know we have a chronic pain issue in this country. So when I moved here, our goal was to try to see how we can avoid amputations as a first-line treatment for patients. Facilitating this goal is to basically see what predictors of amputation exist, take a holistic approach to identifying the risk factors, design an effective and alternative pathway, and to see what we can do. And what we did was, in terms of screening and performing angiograms before an amputation in patients with critical limb ischemia, we're able to decrease the amputation rate significantly by 88% over this 4-year period. And the picture on the right basically shows these are limbs of patients who came to my office where you tell them to take off their socks and you just look at their feet. These patients, majority of whom have never been told that they need to take off their socks. 80% of patients on this screen are diabetics. And just take note of this one on the left, actually, because I'll get to this patient shortly. However, the U.S. Preventive Service Task Force is a portfolio of services to improve the health of all Americans based on evidence-based recommendations, with the CMS providing full coverage for their ratings of A or B. And what they've done is to determine what internal medicine or family practitioners should screen. We know this for cancer, right? We all screen for cancer at a majority of our cancers. But what about these patients who we've just talked about? Well, they said that there is insufficient data to determine the benefits and harms of screening patients who are asymptomatic and screening the general population for PAD. Well, that's not who we're interested in. We're only interested in patients who are considered at risk. If you're diabetic, if you're over an age of 50, you've had a history of nicotine use, you've had a history of other atherosclerotic burden, other beds like your heart, or you've had a stroke, those are patients who are at risk, or if you have chronic kidney disease or high blood pressure. But they failed to do that. And so their comments, these are their words, these comments cite that the evidence that the prevalence of PAD is disproportionately higher among racial and ethnic minorities and low socioeconomic populations. And we note that the I statement could discourage testing and perpetuate disparities in treatment and outcomes. These are well-established disparities in care. However, the evidence on screening and treatment in these groups is currently lacking, and the USPSTF is unable to determine the overall balance of benefits and harms. Future research should include diverse populations and report their outcomes. Well, we have a problem with that last statement. So if you look at research in all the cardiovascular space, as Dr. Washington has alluded to, minorities are underrepresented. This is a typical trial, accomplished trial of a drug called Xarelto that's well known, rivaroxaban in a vascular dose, where patients who had peripheral arterial disease and coronary artery disease, meaning blockages in your legs and your heart, actually had mortality benefit by using this drug. A great drug, multinational trial. They had 27,000 patients, and guess how many Black patients they could enroll? 162. 262 patients. That is unacceptable. If we carry the largest cardiovascular burden, you can only find 262 patients in a 27,000 patient trial. Not to mention, if you look at all the trials from whence we've come from, African Americans, 12% of the US population, but only 5%. Hispanics, 1%, even though they carry close to about 20% now in terms of their growing population. Women, underrepresented in cardiovascular trials. This is unacceptable. And what about the cost of some of these medicines that are used in these to treat these patients in the office? We know that cardiovascular prevention in PAD is important, and these prevention strategies are somewhat underused, but there's a reason why. The patients cannot afford the medicines. Look at the cost. In the state of Mississippi, with the median income, I told you, it's about $36,000 to $38,000. If you're on a Medicaid, maybe you can afford it. But what if you're in Medicare and you did not meet your deductible? Well, you're in it for a long haul in terms of the cash price, but also you have an issue if that deductible is met, you still have to pay close to about $100 a month if you have a Part D plan. Let's talk about heart failure. Heart failure also overlaps that map that I just mentioned in terms of the regional variability where African Americans carry that burden of cardiovascular disease. You have at least a 20x higher incidence of heart failure among Black men and women compared with white men and women before age 50. And African Americans and Hispanics have a higher burden of modifiable risk factors. And those risk factors are what I mentioned: diabetes and hypertension, chronic kidney disease. But the cost to take care of these patients with a drug that's known to have mortality benefit, it's significant. Significant, especially if these patients fall into the donut hole, majority of whom, my patients, 75% whom are on Medicare, do fall into it, with an average cost of about $176 per month. And let's take this, for example. We have a drug that is known to have significant reduction in cardiovascular outcomes that basically was known as a PCSK9 inhibitor. It's known as Repatha, and it's known to decrease actually cardiovascular risk twofold in African Americans versus white subjects. That's a good drug. However, look at the cost of the drug when it first came out. I mean, we're talking about a cost where the reduction in costs went by 60% from an annual price of $14,100 down to $5,850. That is significant. And so when you get upset and when you see despair, sometimes despair is a poor chisel to carve out tomorrow's justice. You get involved, and I got involved in policy. And there's this patient who I met, Mrs. Gertrude Campbell. She unfortunately got an amputation at the age of 72. She had been a diabetic since the age of 54. She had not had appropriate screening prior to that because the USPSTF did not have guidelines to screen patients like her. She got her left leg amputated, and when she came to see me to treat the stump of the left leg, I told her to take her socks off, and her right leg had already become a gangrene leg. So she lost her leg actually in 2015, and we took her to Congress to tell her story in 2018 as the PAD chair for the Association of Black Cardiology, as well as other stakeholders. We testified as to this sprint to zero effort where no one should lose their legs, and these violent practices of amputation should stop. And so the PAD caucus was established in 2019 with the goal of educating Congress and the communities as to why it's important to know about research strategies and policy strategies that need to be enforced for patients who lack a voice. And Representative Payne Jr. from New Jersey and Bilirakis from Florida basically started the PAD caucus. And through this caucus, legislation was introduced basically to raise awareness on peripheral arterial disease, which only 1 in 4 Americans has ever heard of, to authorize funding to establish and coordinate a PAD educational program. Cost sharing should not be an issue in terms of screening for patients who we consider at risk under this provision known as the Amputation Reduction and Compassion Act. And basically, we should disincentivize non-emergent amputations that are performed without appropriate testing and that do not fit the guidelines or the exception rules. And also to have kind of a QI method to go through HHS to reduce amputations relating to PAD. And so in closing, a wish list. The wish list is that, basically we need to stop using this line from 1966. And that line is that of all forms of inequity, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. That was by Dr. Martin Luther King, because it leads to unpreventable deaths. And that is a line that we should not be using, despite all the advancements in technology and all the access to all the research that has gone into developing drugs that we know have mortality benefit. We should have a unified health justice kind of humanity awareness campaign where we need to have basically equity for all when it comes to access, not only to care, but access to quality care. We need to address the social determinants of health peace. We need to support passages of legislation such as the ARC Act, where we know that appropriation measures and reconciliation legislation are in place to stop this inhumane and violent practices of preventable amputations. And we need to collect more data, standardized data representing the local snapshot of the racial and ethnic-based disparities in care, and PAD being an example. What's the number by race and by gender in Mississippi for African Americans versus Hispanics versus Tennessee versus West Virginia versus Arkansas? And then we have to incentivize the recruitment and retention of specialists to the field and to rural areas with evidence of QI interventions and programs using evidence-based medicine to affect outcomes. And monopolies have to be addressed, not only in terms of healthcare consolidation, but also in the pharmaceutical world as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Foluso, for your very powerful presentation. You've laid out some really stunning disparities in care and in access. I guess my first maybe simple question for you is, outside of the PAD caucus, what kind of reaction are you getting from folks, or is it still sort of too early to tell?
Yeah, so we're basically at a phase now where we've had some co-sponsors of the bill. The Cardiovascular Coalition is leading that effort. I think right now we're just trying to get societies to be on board. One has to understand that the fragmentation of care is also a problem, whereby you have someone like myself who's an interventional cardiologist, but also this problem is also being addressed by an interventional radiologist and a vascular surgeon. We all have societies, and all those societies have to come together and say enough is enough, share one concerted effort to not only help raise awareness, just like the oncological space did. They got it right? So if you think of cancer, they got it right. When you look at commercials, it doesn't say, well, stage 4 versus stage 1. Like, let's have this debate. No, cancer is cancer. We need to raise awareness on peripheral arterial disease. We need to mobilize every resource we can and publicize why this is unacceptable in 2021. We need to go to policymakers and with the backing of all our societies in a one unified voice to say this affects the clinical, economical, and human impact of our healthcare system. It's a $252 billion a year cost. And do you know who carries that cost? Mr. Ross, it's you and I, taxpayers. 80% of that bill is borne by taxpayers. So irrespective of where you are politically, left, right, middle, this affects your bottom line. And 80% to 90% of these cases are preventable. So why don't we focus on upstream and let's try to work in appropriate screening strategies for those who are at risk and not think of a 25-year-old who we think is going to come in with peripheral arterial disease. We don't think of 25-year-olds with breast cancer, for instance. We think of an older population. Well, it's a similar mentality here. When a woman presents to a physician's office with a potential mass or lump in the breast tissue, it should not lead straight to a mastectomy without appropriate treatment. You have to diagnose, get the pathology, get screening and ultrasound, mammo. There are just steps that need to be taken. The same concept here. You don't just go straight to chopping off people's limbs and lives, because their lives matter and their limbs matter as well. So yeah, we'll see where things go. I think we're going to reintroduce this bill and whatever support we can get from all policymakers. I think that's more than welcome.
Well, we hear you loud and clear on addressing social determinants. The other thing you mentioned is the fragmentation of care delivery, and so I can put in a plug for the integrated delivery system that is hosting this forum. But life's a little bit different in the Delta in Mississippi, and I just what do you do in Mississippi to improve coordination?
You know what? That's a great question. It's hard. Why is it hard? It's hard because as a 40-year-old cardiologist who lives in the Mississippi Delta, I can tell you that the last time a cardiovascular specialist was recruited to the Delta was in 2012. All right. And so the last time I saw a podiatrist, a full-time residential podiatrist in the Delta was about 5 years ago. And if you look at the landscape in terms of the landscape of not only from insurance standpoint, it's not because out of the 3 million, yeah, sure, there are 516,000 that are uninsured. There are about 700 to 800,000 that are Medicaid. The rest have between commercial and Medicare. So it's not an insurance issue. Yeah, reimbursement rates might vary compared to someone who lives in, who works at UCSF or at Columbia or somewhere in, Alpine, New Jersey. But it's just that you have, this lack of specialty care in the granular areas and especially in rural areas where there isn't much to do. These are places that are deserts, food deserts, but literally it's, you want to get a Starbucks coffee, you got to drive 2 hours. So try and get a physician who's a specialist to bypass a big urban city like a Memphis or Jackson or Oxford to come to a rural area. It's very hard and challenging. Our policymakers do not incentivize specialists like myself to come and start a practice who are not recruited by hospitals. I don't know if you know this. If you're a cardiologist, you cannot come here unrecruited and get assistance with your loan forgiveness program, for instance. You have to go through a hospital system. Well, if we were to just bring up the hospitals and say, what's the hospital climate in the state of Mississippi? Well, it's not that great. I'll tell you that much. Unless you're a big university care center, all of these critical access hospitals are not only vulnerable, but we have about 51 that threaten to close out of the 140. There's 7 counties in this whole state that do not have any type of healthcare coverage. 7 counties. I don't know any other state that can mirror that. So how do we fix these problems? These are intergenerational problems, and that actually need to bring all systems in play in terms of on the state level, local level, and national level. And then societies have to see how they can try and incentivize some of their trainees to come to rural areas rather than send all our trainees out to, Doctors Without Borders to international countries, because we have a big problem here in the States.
You touched on this in your presentation, but I just want to come back to it. We're having a lot of conversations about drug pricing in this country now, but we aren't hearing a lot about racial equity in the context of those conversations. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could just tell us, the connection between high drug prices and racial equity and why it's important to discuss it.
Sure. It has a lot to play if you look at, just for instance, if you look at the chronic diseases that plague in the cardiovascular space. So let me just talk about just cardiovascular disease and some of those medications that I mentioned: high blood pressure, heart failure, obesity, diabetes epidemic. So you look at medications that are coming that address not only the diabetes aspect, but now some of these diabetes meds are used to treat cardiovascular diseases. We're seeing that with what we call SGLT2 inhibitors in heart failure treatment. And so when you start seeing these treatments for these patients, the cost to take care of a patient who presents to my practice, 80% of whom are African Americans, there are a lot of things that have to go through my head. And here they are. For a patient to drive 40 minutes to an hour to come and see a specialist, they have to pay. Some of them have to pay a family member to bring them here or a friend. Why? Because they live in rural areas where the sole provider in that family has to work on that day. And so they have to pay about 20 to 30 bucks, right? Come to see me. They have multiple medical issues. And then out of those issues, you give them a prescription pad and say, yes, I need you to go to your pharmacy. And their assumption is that everything's a $4 drug at Walmart. Well, it's not. There are actually within pharmacies, the generic pricing actually vary, which is, which again speaks to who are the ones controlling the price points, right? Do I have to call the local pharmacy? Do I have to call, a PBM, to figure out how we arrive to this price point? And not only that, what happens to this patient when they go home and realize that not only are their copays high, but now they have other physicians they have to visit for their other comorbidities? And how do they afford this in the context of not having access to high-paying jobs, where they have Medicaid recipients that are limited to 5 drugs that they have to choose from, that to have covered before they go into that paying out-of-pocket option? That in itself is what you see gets played out, where patients come back and say, well, doc, guess what? I had to decide what to do, keep the lights on versus to take my medicine. And they're labeled as non-compliant. And when you're labeled as non-compliant and your patient who has chronic kidney disease and you are put on that, that list for a transplant, kidney transplant, and you miss one of your appointments because of either a transportation issue or you don't take a medication and you're labeled as non-adherent, guess what? You don't get your kidney transplant. And when you don't get your kidney transplant, you die. Or when you don't get those medicines from a cardiovascular standpoint, you end up in the hospital system. And in the hospital system, the cost to take care of the patient in the hospital far exceeds taking care of that patient as an outpatient. And they get stuck with that bill.
Yep.
And the mistrust between these hospitals that do not engage these communities, as spoken before, because of this deep rooted mistrust that preceded Tuskegee. And thank God someone said we need to talk about things other than Tuskegee, because I also get tired of just talking about just Tuskegee. Things occurred way beyond Tuskegee, right? And that deep rooted mistrust is what needs to be addressed. The sharing of power, the decision making, and the willingness to examine new ways of doing things is what I had to think about. And I think community engagement is what I had to do, direct to consumer approach, to kind of explain all these levels to patients.
So we're running up against time here. I just want to ask, because I remember taking it when I was in government, taking a team to the Delta, and that same issue of transportation, and I don't have a car, or my husband had to go to work, so I got to pay the neighbor, and that was a significant barrier. In I don't know, 60 seconds or less, how much does telehealth help us? And again, how much does it help in the Delta?
The gift and the curse. COVID unblinded a lot of disparities, and telehealth is actually one of them, right? It might be shocking to a lot of people, but the realities are 50% of my patients do not have access to the internet. Why is this important now? It's important because most of these patients actually cannot go online and register for the vaccines. These sites require you to have some form of access, right? And there's a phone number you can call now. The state has a phone number, but the majority, it's download an app or 50% don't have access to the internet. And most of these patients do not have access to a smartphone. And so telehealth has helped some in terms of patients who might have access to the internet and what have you. But in terms of our field and examining someone's wound and taking off your socks and checking your circulation and putting my finger on your circulation, it's hard to do that over the phone or via Zoom or FaceTime, because I need to be able to palpate that pulse. I need to be able to tell you if that's concerning or not. I need to be able to examine if you're losing your hair. I need to tell you if that foot is cooler than another. And so there's some benefits, especially when it comes to specialty care coordination, where I as a physician can discuss a patient's case with other physicians and other specialists. But also, there are also, the flip side of that is, there are people in the community who just don't have access. And that is one piece that we need to address, a big piece, because telehealth is here to stay. Access to internet bandwidth, smartphones, and how to make sure that, that trust, because some of the information people feel you're taking from telehealth, there's this mistrust that is being taken and used against them in some other form. And in communities of color, that's something that you also have to address.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fakorede. You have given us a pretty big to-do list here to address all these issues, but we appreciate the rich conversation. Thank you to the audience for submitting questions. We've reached the end of our time, but before I close, I just wanted to remind folks that this event has been recorded, and we will post the videos on kpihp.org in the coming weeks. And again, you may also view the recording of our previous event on pharmaceutical funding and investment on the same website. We're very interested in your feedback on this event, and we'll send you an evaluation and also ask you to share topics or issues that you'd like to see covered in the future. And with that, I'll thank everyone for joining us today, and my thanks to Harriet Washington and Dr. Fakorede and to Dr. Copeland. Great to have your participation. Thanks, everyone.